en Europe. Depuis des années, Climate Change réalise des eMag plutôt à destination des acteurs africains sur l'action climat en Afrique. Et nous introduisons cette année une toute nouvelle série
So
d'eMag.
this year we are starting with a new series of eMags in Africa and Europe, not exclusive, and we will be able to exchange best practices between European and African stakeholders. We also have every 2 months, we will have every 2 months an eMag on climate action in Africa. And the first one will be on April 25th at 3 p.m. Paris time. We'll give you more information at the end of this eMag in order to subscribe to this next eMag. So now eMag is, of course, live translated, French or English. You can choose the language of your choice by clicking on the globe at the bottom. We have both English and French-speaking speakers today.
This eMag is being live translated in French and English, and you can select the language by clicking on the globe icon just at the bottom of your screen. N'hésitez pas à vous renommer avec votre nom et votre organisation.
Please do not hesitate to put down your name, write down in the chat book your name and the name of your organization. Do not hesitate to post your comments or remarks in the chat box. This will be recorded for your information. Before I start, my name is Estelle, in charge of events, and I will be your moderator today. For those of you who might know this, this is an international organization founded in 2015 to federate non-state actors recognized by the UNFCCC, civil societies, local actors to federate through events in national, international summits in Africa and Europe to analyze through some publications of our observatory and to publish through our portal of climate action on our website. You can find a mapping of our actions. Now, we also have on top of these 3 assignments and to continue our work on adaptation, climate change in Europe, following the Climate Change Summit that took place in February in Liège in Belgium on this topic. We also offer every 2 months from March to January some dedicated moments for focusing on Europe and adaptation. This summit concluded with a declaration, a Liège declaration, which is a collective roadmap in terms of public policies relating to adaptation to climate change in Europe, and a series of adaptation relating to the declaration. This new European time is very important. This year will take place a number of elections, and in Europe elections, in order to renew the Green Deal. Every eMag will be followed by a magazine that will be published both in PDF format in French and English on our website. And you can take a look at the first schedule for the first eMag. There you go. As you can see on the screen now, the first series of eMag of the first quarter, Q1 of 24. So the various topics are here. So May 30th, we'll be talking about social justice in political policy, for adaptation in Europe. Second one in July, resilience in European cities. And the rest of the program will be developed further. Now, to give you a bit more information about the program and the schedule, you can click on the link which will be posted on in the chat box. Now, today we will start with a presentation of a new study called Planning and Adaptation in the EU, the state of the multi-level adaptation policies, which Tania will present. Tania, and then we will have Amandine Martinet. She's a journalist at Construction 21. She will present a press review of the latest news. Then we will enter into our more technical discussion with a great panel, and we'll be talking about the role of territories and sub-levels in the policies of adaptation in Europe from a top-down approach with Cornelia Rietdorf working for the Competence Center KomPass of the Environment Agency in Germany. Then we will hear from a more bottom-up approach with Luca Gurrieri, who is the climate director for climate and air quality in Lombardy. And then we will have another presentation from Manuel, coordinator of the region and for AWAC in Belgium. Then we will have Peter Eckersley, who is an associate professor at Nottingham Trent University. And then we will conclude with a more practical example regarding adaptation presented by Ronan Dantec, who is senator and chair of Climate Chance. The last 15 minutes of our eMag will be dedicated to a Q&A session and to our audience. So by then, please do not hesitate to post any questions that you may want to ask, and do say who you are and where you are coming from. So we want to thank again everyone for being here today with us. So we want to thank also our interpreter. And I want to give the floor now to Tania for the presentation of this trajectory. And you can find this also in the link on the chat. So Tania, you have the floor now.
Thank you so much, Estelle. I will be speaking in English, and I'm going to be presenting some of the takeaways from the study that we published today, for which you have the link in the chat. And the idea is that with this presentation, I'm going to sort of frame the discussion that we'll have later on today. So where do we start? Perhaps the best place to understand multi-level adaptation policy in Europe is by looking at what it consists of, what are the different steps in the policy cycle. And because we're in the context of Europe, you have here on your screens the steps of the adaptation policy cycle as enumerated by the European Environmental Agency and its adaptation support tools. So now this can take different iterations depending on how it's presented, but it more or less the steps remain the same across different levels or geographical areas. So the first step is, of course, preparing the ground for adaptation. And by that, we mean setting up the political willingness to do it, finding the resources that will be mobilized over the course of this entire process, and getting all of that ready. And then concretely, you begin with an assessment of the risks and vulnerabilities that the particular system, or in this case, the particular territory, is faced with. And this can be as detailed as possible, looking at different economic sectors, looking at different geographical regions, and the more detailed it is, the better you can plan your adaptation after. And so the next step is obviously identifying the different adaptation options based on the risks and vulnerabilities that have been identified in terms of climate change for the particular territory. And then once you identify the adaptation options, the next step is to compare them in terms of costs, benefits, feasibility, and comparing each of them will result in the creation of political documents such as an adaptation strategy, which is generally a longer-term political document where the government or the entity in question identifies the longer-term objectives or visions in terms of adaptation and what they intend to do. And when we reach the implementation stage, which is enacting these actions, this political document can be translated into an adaptation plan, which is a document which very concretely lays out the steps, the actions that the government or the territory intends to put into place. And then once everything is in place, once the action is starting to be realized, and once it runs its course, the next step is the monitoring of things to make sure that it is working as intended, and evaluating how it's working, whether the initial objectives that were set out have been met or not, which then feeds into the next cycle. So this is how the adaptation policy cycle in general is structured. And this can be at different levels. It can be at the European level, it can be at the national level, or at the regional and local levels. And that is the importance of vertical integration. What is vertical integration? It is the process of creating intentional linkages and coordinating as much as possible all of these steps across each of the levels. So now if we look at this diagram that you have on the screen, it sort of lays out the governance that exists at the European level. And what we notice is that the main driving vision for adaptation in Europe is the European Adaptation Strategy, which is based mainly on the European Climate Law, which is the regulation that aims to engrave in law and to make obligatory what the member states are required to do to meet the objectives of the Green Deal, to meet the European Union's 2050 objectives. And while the European Climate Law was created in 2021, this framework sort of predates that. And you also have the regulation that governs the Energy Union and climate action in the EU, which set up the framework towards meeting 2030 objectives, but also more in terms of energy stability. And so whatever falls under the purview of the governance regulation looks at climate action from a more energy and mitigation related perspective. But as you can see from this visual, everything is intrinsically linked. And so when we come down to the level of member states, this is where the differences start to be evident. So there's some countries that prefer a top-down approach where there's a national climate law in place, which then defines what each level of governance is obliged to do and what documents they're required to produce. There are other countries that prefer a more bottom-up approach, where at the national level, things might be less well defined, and it's really the local governments or the regions that are driving climate action. And another thing to note here is that as we move further down in the levels, there's even more uncertainty in terms of what is required, what is being done, because it becomes that much harder to measure. And so finally, if we go to the next slide, we see that all of these policy documents, which you saw in the previous slide, are part of a really well thought out system at the European level. And stay with me here because this can look quite heavy as an infographic, but it's meant to be read from left to right temporally, and from top to bottom in terms of specificity. So it moves from being general climate and energy planning to being adaptation planning more precisely as we move further down. So what the key takeaway from this one graph is that in terms of mitigation and energy planning, things are extremely well laid out, and there's this really complex system that really specifies what the target is at the European level, what each member state undertakes, and how it works at each level of governance. And you also have this system where every policy document needs to be submitted to the Commission. It is then reviewed, and the updates need to be taken into account before the plan is put into place, etc. But when we look at the adaptation strategy, we see that national adaptation plans or strategies remain quite ambiguous at the European level, in the sense that there is no obligation that says that you need to have an adaptation plan or a strategy, because it's not defined what constitutes a strategy or a plan. Neither is it defined in terms of time. And this can be chalked down to the development of adaptation policy in the European Union as a whole, where it was initially it was at the level of member states that there was an initiative, which later came together and drove European policy. So this sort of piecemeal development of policies can also be seen as the reason behind this, where some countries are a lot more advanced in their adaptation planning and have adaptation plans that date back to the early 2000s, whereas some have just joined the wagon. So to set up the debate for today, where are we actually in terms of the subnational levels? In the study, which you'll find on our website, what we found is that risk and vulnerability assessments at all levels are improving. They're being more comprehensive. There are even countries, regions, and cities that have completed a whole cycle and are doing a second one, which is even more comprehensive and well coordinated. We see that planning is improving. Peter might talk about that later on today at all levels. But the point of the blocking point remains monitoring and evaluation, which might be related to the nature of adaptation as a whole. And you can find out more in the study. With that, I will wind up. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tania. Merci beaucoup. N'hésitez pas à aller lire notre étude plus en longueur via le lien.
So do not hesitate to read this via the link which has been posted now on the link in the chat box. Now I want to give the floor to Amandine Martinet. She's a journalist at Construction 121. We can see that adaptation is more and more present in the media. And that's why we have a partnership with Construction 21 to do a review of what is being presented in the French and British medias regarding adaptation. Thank you very much, Estelle. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. We are glad to be here with you today. Thank you, Climate Chance, for organizing this webinar. Representing Construction 21, which is a media. In order to continue on this, we have a press review now, which we want to present. We have very little time, so we want to focus on the French updates and news. But as you know, that the European update is also very rich. Now, moving on to the first article. This is an event that took place at the end of January. We went there, we attended this event, which took place in the Natural Museum of Paris. During that event, the Minister of the Energy Transition, Christophe Béchu, was there and gathered a number of experts talking about territories, ecological transitions, to talk about the future of France regarding the +4 degrees by 2000 or 2050, according to various provisions. So we also had Ronan Dantec, the chair of Climate Change, who was there. Also Jean-Marc Lechovici, who is also the president of a project, and also of Jean-Marc was very straightforward to raise awareness. He said the world is going to become more difficult to manage. We're going to have to dedicate some intellectual means in order to tackle this issue. He was quite direct, and to support his intervention, the other speaker also highlighted the necessary means in order to adapt our territories. I'm quoting, out of the 7.5 billion euros, the public authorities could take apart a couple of billions to train the stakeholders and help them in these new priorities. You can find out more about this as you read this article. Moving on to the next item of our selection. There was an article published recently on our website, Construction 21, dedicated to adaptation and resilience. We have an article from Guillaume Dolkes. He is a researcher at I4CE, and he wanted to focus on the cost of adaptation and the need to integrate these costs right from the start of a project. So what he highlighted was to try to be more proactive, to go beyond rules and regulations that are already existing by insisting on the environment of the building, not just the actual building. For example, the greening of the environment and the morphology of the streets of the cities. So our experts said that the question was also very political, of course. So he talked about the various kinds of adaptation for our buildings and cities with extreme temperatures or having more simple approaches. Coming now to my third article of our selection. This was in another territory in Marseille, in the south of France. In this article, we have an elected member who is in charge of transition. She spoke in January during an event in Paris, and she presented, and Climate Chance was there as well, and she presented a manifesto of the European, Mediterranean cities and regions, and she quoted, I'm quoting from her rather, she said, us, Marseille, are living out the climate changes that France, the rest of France will experience in a few years. So Marseille has to be an experimenter for other territories. You can find out more again about this in this article. Now coming to the last content of our selection, now coming back to a more national framework, and this is the last report of the Court of Auditors a few weeks ago, and we went there. There were some strong words from the chair, Pierre Moscovici, of the Court of Auditors. Adaptation to climate change remains a blind spot of French policies. So the Court of Editors issued a number of advices for a better adaptation. For this institution, we should really adapt a triptych, that is to know the risk, to inform the public, and to plan our strategies. For example, the various levers which were highlighted by the Court of Editors, a better adaptation, better financing schemes. According to Pierre Moscovici, these are schemes which could be adapted to works to prevent flooding risks, for example. They spoke also of cooperation between various stakeholders at territorial levels to go beyond what is already in place. For example, the regreening, protecting the coastal areas. These are things which are not sufficiently developed. And I would conclude with this one last article by recalling the fact that we know that the French government recently chose to make some cost savings in 2024 because of the amount of expenses, and 1 billion, as you might know, has been reduced or taken out rather of the global budget. This is it for our press review. Thank you, Amandine. Indeed, we can see that this topic of adaptation is something that is more covered in the media, which is a good thing. Now we're going to turn to our representatives and experts from various European regions to see how they are tackling this issue. We're going to start with a top-down approach, and then moving on to a more bottom-up approach and then we will end with a more practical example. Now, without further ado, I want to give the floor to Cornelia.
German Environmental Agency, and later this year, a new climate adaptation law will come into force in Germany. How will the law set up the framework of the different levels of governance, especially the regional and the local ones? And what role does the KomPass Competence Center play in the implementation of these subnational adaptation plans as a knowledge portal? The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, hello everyone. Thank you very much to Climate Chance for setting up this interesting workshop or meeting today. Yeah, I'm from the German Environment Agency at the Competence Center of Climate Impacts and Adaptation. And yeah, was invited to talk a bit about the climate adaptation law in Germany, which was part of the sorry, missing first the coalition agreement in 2021 and developed over years, published federal government on 22nd of December in 2023 and come into act in July this summer, so in 2024. And it's a binding framework for climate adaptation in Germany, and intends to establish an important base for a comprehensive and nationwide establishing nationwide and comprehensive preventive measures. and also to give planning and investment security, as well as more clarification of responsibilities in implementing during the adaptation strategy between the federal state and the states. And so here on this, it's also the main slide of the presentation today. Is the core element of the law is the development of a new precautionary climate adaptation strategy with measurable targets. And targets. So we have an adaptation strategy since 2008, but it gets
yeah. Sorry to interrupt. Maybe we hear you in fractions. So maybe if you could switch off the camera, if it might help the connection.
So yeah, it's already switched off. Is it better now? I don't know. It must be the weather and storm in Berlin. Okay, sorry for that. So I hope it's getting better. So yeah, I was just about to give just the core bullet points of the core elements. Okay, thank you. Good to know. Sounds better. Of the climate adaptation law, and one of the core parts is the. Oh, sorry, it's still the previous slide. Yeah, here. It's a precautionary climate adaptation strategy with measurable targets. And there the federal ministries are responsible to develop those measurable targets and also have a regular evaluation progress based on a monitoring report, which is due every 4 years. At the federal level as well, we have the climate risk assessments. So that's already also in place since quite a few years. And it's repeated every 8 years. A new part will be a register of damages and expenditure that will be then integrated also in the monitoring, like with more data informing, the question of costs from the finances. The federal states are responsible for the development and implementation of own climate adaptation strategies and guiding the municipalities that local climate adaptation concepts are developed based on this local risk assessments. And that's also very important for us that they have biannual reporting duties for the federal government, because that so far has been very challenging. For example, for the government's irrigation reporting to get national information data, because the German state couldn't force municipalities and some national level to. Okay, so I also see in the chat that it's still difficult to understand me. So yeah, maybe getting to that slide. So that's the policy cycle of the climate adaptation process in Germany. It's already in place for quite some time. So with first a climate risk assessment, then the adaptation action plan, which now also includes new measurable targets and indicators. And we have the implementation of the measures, so that will continue. And the monitoring report will also include the adjustments and public expenditure data, as well as measurable targets from new strategy. And then evaluation, as also Tania mentioned in the beginning, is also to be set up new. So far we had evaluation of the political process. And now we'll also try to solve the difficulties to measure impacts of our adaptation measures. So this is just, so we just recently announced or published the monitoring report, and have this since 2015. We look into climate impact indicators as well as into response indicators. And the new report is due in 2027, and there we currently look how to merge now in those new measurable targets and indicators into the new monitoring report. And now just to the final slide. Next slide. Yeah, thank you. So that's just to show that it's still a very participatory. Yeah.
If I could just ask you to wrap up, please, for timing.
Yes, it's a final slide, and just very briefly, so you see many boxes. So that's the participatory process of the development of the measurable targets and indicators. So all the ministries were involved in the whole year of 2022 and also good part of 2023. And then we had citizen dialogues, consultation with stakeholders, and joint working groups of federal states and ministries to really discuss the targets, if they make sense, if they align, or if they have additional suggestions. And what was also new, that we specifically also invited youth to comment and look into this and give feedback. And yeah, saw that as a very valuable process, because it, on the one hand, could confirm some of the targets that were set, but also bring in new perspectives for the ministries to take into account. Yeah, for that. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cornelia. Here is the email of Cornelia if you want to reach out to her. Let's now switch to our second speaker, Luca from the Lombard region. The Lombard region has recently adopted its own adaptation plan, despite there is no guiding plan coming up from the national level. Could you please tell us how the Lombard adaptation plan exemplifies the voluntary initiative and the bottom-up approach in driving adaptation action?
Okay, thank you very much to everyone, and thanks for your invitation, and thanks to Climate Chance for this opportunity. I will speak briefly about some issues and our policies about adaptation. In general, adaptation policy and the regional governments have a crucial role in to play in addressing climate change and ensuring concrete results in adaptation actions. And this role is justified by direct contact with the citizen, the territorial capacity in identifying challenges, solutions, strategic and powerful synergies with other regions and policies. Next slide, please. Some adaptation tools that we developed in Lombardy region in these last years. We approved in the last 5 years guidelines and plans for adaptation. We have been the first region in Italy to develop policies on adaptation. And we have a strong collaboration with stakeholders, and we have solid scientific information from our foundation for the environment. And we have also wide international cooperation with important network and at the regional and the subnational level, as you can see in the last point. Next, please. Downscaling climate change policies to local level is really crucial to achieve the objective of adaptation. Downscaling policies give us the opportunity to push the international, national, and regional policies and initiatives down to localities. In few words, regions are at an intermediate position, and their role is to receive and distribute policies at the same time. This is a huge responsibility for us of downscaling policies in the most efficient way to the localities to receive the best result. Next, please. About some few words about top-down and bottom-up approaches. It is really important to have strong cooperation and coordination of these two dimensions, top-down and bottom-up approach, to better combine international conventions with territorial policies. Top-down and bottom-up approach must be combined and enforced, because only if all levels of governance are fully coordinated, ambitious climate policies will be successfully implemented. In fact, the PCC, the United Nations, and other international organizations are now fully aware of these and call for cooperative, coordinated efforts among municipal, regional, national, and international institutions. Next, please. A few words on multi-level action. The motion for a resolution of the EU Parliament on 2022 COP calls on all parties to take urgent action against CO2 and methane emissions. You can read below part of the resolution, but I have to underline some points. The motion underlines that while climate change is a global problem, each region is already being affected differently, and that local governments being closer to population are key actors to facilitating climate change adaptation. And the call for support for a regional and decentralized approach in the response to climate change effects, and give to the local authorities, local civil society organization, and environmental defenders a greater role in tackling the effects of climate change and to reach the most vulnerable. Next, the collaboration between regions is fundamental. Today's event demonstrate our efforts to enhance dialogue on implementing issues of mutual interest and enhancing the best practice, and help us in raising our voices in the international level. Another important tool that we are using is bilateral meetings between regions that assure us dialogue and further specific learning from respective experiences. Next, please. A few words about mitigation. We have approved recently the Regional Energy, Environmental and Climate Program aligned with the Fit for 55 strategy in order to reduce consumption, increase in efficiency, and increase renewables. We will have the opportunity to discuss also this if you want. The next one. We are now actually working on a regional climate law proposal to develop a climate law in order to deal with the effects of climate change through both the dimension, the mitigation and the adaptation. And speaking about this, about developing all the actions that aim at facing extreme meteorological events, reducing the heat highlands in the urban areas, adjusting crops, and orienting economic development in the Pre-Alps and Alps area, resizing winter sports and activities. Next. Some news instruments introduced by this proposal. If we will have occasion, we can. We will have if we will have the opportunity, we can discuss about. We will have a specific exchange about this proposal of law that is in this moment in the discussion between the direction of our at the regional level. The last one, the other one, please. Concretely, I would to show you some measures for for adaptation. For example, in these last 2 years, we developed many measures, and we allocated many millions of euros in activity, for example, like the waterproofing of basement in some areas of the city, and in this case, for example, with the collaboration of our agency for forestry. And in this case, we allocated 5 million euros. Next one.
If you could please wrap up, Gianluca.
I finish. Okay, I will finish immediately. Here, another example of adaptation measures in the impermeabilization with the university. We allocated 4 million euros to do action in the areas of the universities. And the last one, also here is with some agreement between fund for the bank foundation and territorial area, some territorial area. We developed the waterproofing intervention also with a total amount of you see many millions of euro in a wide part of Lombardy region. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gianluca, and for really showing us very concrete measures and adaptation measures from the Lombard region. Nous allons maintenant nous tourner vers Manuel Harchies de l'Institut.
Now we're going to turn to Manuel Harchies, who is the coordinator of AWAC in Belgium, with a consortium of 5 partners to carry out a study over 2 years to gather all the scientific knowledge in terms of vulnerability and adaptation, to provide tools, operational tools for adaptation and resilience to stakeholders. Manuel, could you tell us a bit more about these studies and what are the risks which you have identified? Maybe a bit of background context. In the Walloon region, we decided to tackle adaptation with regards to climate change from a bottom-up approach, with a support to the municipalities as to how to tackle the issue of adaptation along the way. With the Convention of the Mayors, also looking for a balance between providing some tools, turnkey tools, and also reinforcing capacities and building capacities. First, we provided an assessment of vulnerabilities, which municipalities could take on board, realizing it would not be the same. And then when things became a bit more complex, then we realized there were more specificities according to regions. Here, I'm sharing a tool which was developed in 2017, Adapta Commune, and through 8 various regional sectors, we asked a number of questions which any municipality could simply answer. And thanks to these questions, the person in charge and the municipality could find some information as to the various vulnerabilities in one given territory, and then deep dive into a number of indicators regarding floodings, regarding the number of housing buildings in a given sector, or the number of health facilities, etc. Now, the study that we are carrying out aims at taking this a bit further. In parallel, we have some mapping, for example, to show the flooding areas and all the buildings in one given area. These are static mapping or mappings, but today in our study, we realized that we need to go even further. We need to deep dive and go a bit deeper in all the knowledge that we already have in order to give the best indicators possible. But this is a two-way thing, a two-way approach. With a more efficient tool, we try to feed into what municipalities already have at hand here. For example, you have an example of the Dutch portal, which we use as a basis. What does a map show? In order to have some tools to explore the various scenarios, to better understand the challenges. So we have here 3 scenarios possible, +2, +3, or +4 degrees. And for a lot of these maps, we have the same option every time, which we call either the current climate, and then we also have explanations next to the map, and we have a dynamic approach. We realize that the climate risks also have a need to have a more dynamic aspect. For example, the risk of heavy rainfalls falling on a region with crops fields to another region coming next to infrastructure. So we can see that this aspect is difficult to show on a static map. So we're trying with this portal and with this tool to be able to help people understand this issue better, to provide tools, but also stakeholders like forest managers or managers dealing with a basin, water basin. So this is aimed at reaching different stakeholders. And it is a two-way approach, as I was saying, because it's a way to provide with various knowledge and to bring knowledge and to various local and regional stakeholders regarding adaptation, which is another aspect which we see in adaptation plan, but municipalities are provided with tools for adaptation plans. We have very set objectives. It has to be part of a consistent strategy. So all the material which we collect and assess should serve as a basis for adaptation plan to give the main guidelines to help municipalities to have more consistent actions. We've seen in the past some inconsistencies where every municipality had to develop their own ecological approach, but sometimes there was an interaction between one municipality and the next and the neighbor. So the goal here is really to provide with the tools, but also to give municipalities a good framework in which they can also find ways to adapt, especially this mapping tool. Thank you very much, Manu, for this example of a bottom-up approach. Here again, I want to share my screen. Moving on.
Voilà, our next panelist today is Peter Eckersley, professor at the Nottingham Trent University. Before joining academia, Peter worked with local governments, and he holds a PhD in local governance. Peter has also recently contributed to a study on the quality of urban adaptation plans in Europe. So Peter, could you please tell us what are the main results of that study and how are cities and regions doing in terms of implementing the adaptation plans? And for your information, you can find the link of the study I am referring to in the chat. Peter, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Estelle. I'm going to talk about this study that we conducted with colleagues from right across Europe. So we had about 40 people altogether working on the study, different people looking at different countries essentially, and these were the main contributors towards this. But as I said, we did have other people from elsewhere as well. We can just go on to the next slide. Thank you. So essentially, this is what we wanted to try and find out. Are European cities getting better at climate adaptation? And how can we measure the quality of adaptation planning? Can we indeed measure the quality of adaptation planning? We've heard quite a bit already about the fact that adaptation can be difficult to capture and difficult to measure and difficult to define almost. And this makes it quite difficult in many cases to conduct studies on it, because there may be initiatives that are implemented that don't necessarily are not necessarily framed in the way of adaptation, but actually contribute towards urban resilience. So what we did was, rather than trying to evaluate the effectiveness of specific policies or specific measures, we looked at the plans that different cities across Europe have developed and implemented over time. And this was the study that was published last year in a Nature journal, Urban Sustainability. So this is what we did essentially. We kind of selected 327 cities across Europe, These are identified by Eurostat as kind of trying to represent the cross section of European cities. So they include capital cities, they also include kind of regional cities, but also smaller ones as well from different parts of. Sorry, I will try and speak slowly. From different parts of Europe, but all EU 28 countries were represented. So when the selection was initially made, the UK was part of the European Union. We had at least one analyst in each of the 28 countries would analyse and collect these planning documents from all of the cities that were part of this selection within that country, and they essentially look at the contents of these plans to identify how good they were and whether over time the earlier plans, say, were not quite as developed or as comprehensive as the later ones. So out of the 327 cities, 167 had developed adaptation plans. So just over half of them had got a plan in place. Okay, next slide, please. Yes. So we've seen diagrams like this already in the session this afternoon, but these essentially were the 6 elements of adaptation planning that we wanted to evaluate as part of our study. And so we developed indicators and questions for each of the researchers in each of the different countries to examine each of these 6 elements. So that the fact base, which was around the risk assessment within the locality, how vulnerable was this city to different climate threats, different climate risks. We then looked at the goals that the plan included. What kind of adaptation goals were set out by the municipality to achieve? Was there any kind of timeline on those goals? Were they quantified? We then looked at the specific measures that they were proposing, the areas in which they were proposing those measures. We then tried to look at implementation, so the different kind of tools that they were adopting, the different processes they were adopting to implement these policies. Obviously, we can't necessarily evaluate whether they've been implemented or how effective they've been, but nonetheless, we still tried to incorporate this into our assessment. We then tried to see whether there was any kind of monitoring or evaluation framework process within the plan. Was the city intending to revisit what it had done in a few years' time to see whether those measures had been achieved? And finally, we looked at participation as well, the involvement of societal groups and industry, particularly vulnerable groups, in the development of climate policies and in the evaluation of those climate policies. So in each of those 6 elements, we had a series of questions that each of the researchers thought about when they were looking at the plans from each of the cities in their respective countries. And altogether, they then created an index. And these are all of the 167 plans that we looked at, mapped out over time. The earliest one was back in 2005, and you can see, obviously, more recently, we've had more plans published. So the yellow dots represent the earliest third of plans, the blue ones, the middle third of plans, and the green ones, the more recent plans. We had a cut-off date at the end of 2020, so we only looked at plans up until that were published and grouped by local municipalities up until the end of 2020. And you can see there is a gradual increase in the scores that we awarded these plans over that period of time. Not necessarily that linear, there was a bit of up and down, but nonetheless, plans, generally speaking, got better over time. Next slide. And not only did they get better over time, but actually against each of our 6 principles as well, that I showed in the diagram before, there was also an improvement. So in terms of the impacts, the adaptation goals, the measures, the implementation, the monitoring, and the participation. Steady increase over time in quality of those. Okay, next slide. What was particularly interesting, perhaps, or one element of it was that we found some regional clusters of perhaps good practice. And so if we look here, the green plans are the most recent ones, and the yellow ones are the older ones. And the bigger the octagon to represent the city, the better we found the plan to be as well. And so we can see how, say, in Ireland, for example, we had quite a cluster of high quality plans in Ireland, also in Poland, which was perhaps a bit more interesting given the national government's position on climate policy up until that point. But looking at, and also in France. And one thing about particularly, say, France and also Ireland, is that there was a mandate on municipalities to do this kind of thing. Particularly in Ireland, not only were municipalities required to produce adaptation plans, but there was a certain structure in terms of what needed to be included in those plans. So there had to be an assessment of local climate risks, for example, and there had to be some kind of involvement of local people. And so Irish cities performed comparatively well against our index than many cities elsewhere. Next slide. Yeah, next. Another finding that we found was that cities generally are getting better at linking the risks to the goals and the measures. So the risks that they identified right at the outset are now more likely to be linked in some way to actually what that city is intending to do. So initially, there might just be a list of climate risks, but not necessarily any measures or any policies that would address that specific risk. And this also goes for, in terms of the sectors or the industries within the city that they identified as being particularly at risk as well. There's a much better connection, we call this the consistency between what the identified risks were and what the measures were that the city was proposing to. Next slide.
If you could please wrap up, Peter, thank you.
Okay, yeah. One thing that we found was actually, though, that cities are doing less to address the needs of vulnerable cities. And this was perhaps the weakest thing that we found about the plans, was that particularly older people, the very young people, people with disabilities, for example, there was a lot less of their involvement in policy making, but also in terms of the measures that the city was adopting that were targeted at these specific groups. And of course, these are the people that are most vulnerable to flooding, to heat waves, and to the other risks that we'll see come from climate change in the future. Next slide.
Thank you very much, Peter.
Yeah.
We can see that regions and cities are, on average, improving on those things. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Notre dernier intervenant aujourd'hui, ce
Now,
sera...
our last speaker now will be Ronan Dantec, who is a senator for Loire-Atlantique and president chair of Climate Change.
Monsieur Dantec travaille depuis de nombreuses
Climate Change.
sur les questions d'adaptation.
He's been working for many years on adaptation policies in France and in Europe. France has elaborated a reference that Amandine was talking about earlier on for adaptation to +4 degrees. So, Renaud, can you tell us a bit more about what this is and how this trajectory for +degrees will support the territories in adaptation? Oh, hello, everyone. The question might go a bit fast, as was already said in the press review regarding construction 21. This is quite new, actually. France has adopted a trajectory, a reference trajectory or a reference. So this would require a bit of time to step back and look at this. Now, one thing that I could underline now, and we mentioned this in Liège during the summit, this is not the same case for territories to have a reference trajectory from the state or having to establish a trajectory at local level. Unfortunately, we have lost the connection with our speaker. We can't hear you, Renaud. We can't hear our speaker anymore. We have lost the connection. We have lost our connection with Ronan. Okay, can you hear me again? I don't know what happened, says Ronan. I don't know when you lost me. What I was saying really is that in France now we do have a reference trajectory +4 degrees. +4 degrees again is a reminder. This is only the French translation of what we already know of the commitment of states after the Glasgow conference. If states maintain their commitment, we will reach a global warming around 7 or 8 degrees, which is about 4 degrees for France. So this is not a global +4. This is a French scenario, scientific scenario corresponding to the state commitments for a 4+ degrees in France, because our land is warming closer than the sea and the north quicker than the south. So we don't quite know yet what is the impact, but this is a strong political impact or willingness. We are waiting now for a national plan, number 3, which will be published at the end of the first half of the year, end of the spring. And then we will see what will be the consequences. Now, what's important to say here, and I was listening to the various speakers before, is that our territories need a lot of knowledge. Once you have a reference trajectory, what does this mean in terms of drought, in terms of climate hazards or rain episodes, etc.? What are the various developments that could be anticipated over 40 years with various degrees? This is more of a matrix approach. What I think is important to say here, and that would go well with what has been said previously, adaptation was a poor element of climate change discussions. Before, we were talking mainly of gas emission reductions. Of course, we are not going to reduce our efforts in that sense, but still today, we see a willingness from various stakeholders to bring back a balance between adaptation and mitigation, because the climate change evidence is here. You know, we are seeing droughts, we're seeing floods, etc. in France or in Belgium. So there is now a willingness to switch to adaptation topics, but we must first of all identify what it is that we must expect. So Météo France, the French weather company, has been asked by the government to work on this trajectory, to look at the technical consequences as well, with various stakeholders like ADEME or CEREMA. They have been asked by the government or required by the government to bring some elements to involve all the national stakeholders. So we are developing this culture, this common culture, and then we will need to take it further in the diagnosis, in the vulnerability diagnosis, in the strategies. This is compulsory in all the climate plans in France. And then we will need to address the issues of financing, etc., etc. So there will be a lot of questions which will be raised in the next 10 years. Maybe another point which we did not talk about, we need to say that social stakes will become key factors. The more vulnerable you are, the more you are likely to suffer from bad adaptation or from a lack of adaptation measures. This is going to be a main stake. And another challenge, which is important, and I spoke this morning to a group of insurance companies, the issue of insurance is going to become a key factor. We're going to talk about the major private companies, or is it going to be the states when it comes to natural disasters? So all of these questions are on the table at the moment. So at this stage, we're really coming into the heart of the matter. I provided a report in 2019 regarding the lack and the lack of reports on these issues, but we have managed to catch up now. But still, we need to have a more specific idea of consequences of climate change, of social consequences, and to have strategies at multi-levels, especially in terms of financing and also by including the insurance aspect. So we are at a tipping point, really, which is very obvious here in France, but also we saw this during the summit in Belgium, but still we haven't quite yet reached robust adaptation measures, which will be needed in Europe, and this will require more time, more discussions like what we are doing today. That was it for me. Thank you very much, Ronan. Indeed, we must keep in mind all these various elements which need to be included in order to be able to set up adaptation plans which will be compliant or which will be in line rather with every trajectory and every vulnerability. Thank you to all of our speakers today for their presentations, which were quite technical but so important when we talk of adaptation to climate change in Europe. We are going to end this eMag. We don't have a lot of time left, but let's take a few questions. I'm going to give the floor now to Tania for the Q&A session. Do not hesitate to raise your hand and to take the floor to raise your question in live.
Oui, merci Estelle.
Thank you,
Absolutely. If you
Estelle.
have any questions, please feel free to raise your hand and then maybe we could have some questions live, which would be more interactive. If not, we have noted some questions from the chat, but if you have questions, now is the moment. Raise your hand, please. Okay, so maybe while you formulate your questions, I can post the first one that we have in the chat. We had a question from Barbara Fraschietta to, I believe it was to Manuel Harchies. Ces scénarios sont-ils utilisés pour l'évaluation climatique européenne requise pour les infrastructures et les constructions?
Requested for infrastructures and constructions. Yes, the idea here with the various scenarios, we are basing ourselves on the concept of impact, taking into account the idea of risk expositions, vulnerabilities, and hazards. And with these scenarios, we build the hazards, and then the various hazards are exposed to various elements. We also study the various infrastructures, the critical infrastructures, namely, a quick comment. Things are changing, but risk management and risk assessment and adaptation, on the other hand, these are two different separate worlds, really. These are different people working on these two issues who don't really communicate, which is changing slightly in, for example, to get the existing data as to risk management and risk infrastructure, the risk is very difficult. On the other hand, they have made progress on this directive, but more in a quality way rather than geolocalized data. So we decided to step back regarding the critical structures to have a broader approach with a level of technicity which we are assessing in line with vulnerability, to define a level of acceptability, the level of water level which can be accepted, for example, in a hospital. And we reconcile these different elements. So it's not at the scale of a municipality, but we want to have statistics regarding the number of infrastructures that could be impacted. We are also exploring the issue of networks, of transport networks. This is what we call cascade risks, or cascading risks. So we assess the various risks. So yes, this is integrated in this dimension, and we are hoping to be able to reconcile these two worlds, really, which are still separate, which I think is necessary. There's a nice infographic on this topic of the risk management and how to better include it in the normalization or coming back to the normal situation. To add to this, maybe regarding risk management, now depending on the various scenarios, are there very different risks, or are the risks pretty much the same with a different frequency or different expectation? You have 2, 3, and 4 degrees, which is a big difference. So what are the results? What are the differences in terms of impacts with the various scenarios which you have established? We haven't quite completed the report yet to reveal the first information, but the main announcement I could say was around the fact that in a world with +2 degrees, the trauma episode that we experienced in 2021 in the Weis Valley in Liège in Belgium, depending on the methods we use, could go from 700 years to 1,000 years. Now we are more around return periods of 10 years. There is a concentration with the region of extreme, with the issue of extreme rain, heavy rains. So in these 2-degree scenarios, there is a big increase. But in a different scenario, in the +3 or +4 degrees, it's not always very obvious to measure what could happen with the rainfall. We've seen a trend to decrease, but an increase of the drought risks, which are becoming more important, and therefore a risk of forest fires, which we did not really have before so much. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. I don't know if the other speakers taking 30 seconds would like to comment on that before we wrap up. I see that Peter has already put a message in the chat. Gianluca, Cornelia, if you're still here.
Adressé plutôt à Peter, puisqu'il évoquait...
I have a question for Peter, says Manu. He spoke about social impact, social challenges. We saw that as well. We crossed data, sharing or checking various scenarios, and we've seen great gaps. And we came across a number of issues of measuring or we've seen vulnerabilities around the energy, which we could easily connect to adaptation plan, and we can easily find action plans. Now, regarding social issues, there's a big gap. There are social policies, but the actual social goals from Europe for which we could on which we could rely, I wondered if in what you have seen in the various plans, did you see anyone who were able to have direct adaptation plans to reduce the social discrepancies? We are screening all the adaptation plan in views of social views. But did you identify any measures with specific goals to reduce the social impact? That's quite a challenge.
Yes, not very many, but we did find some. So, I mean, one example would be one city in Ireland, I think it was Galway, in their old people's homes, for example. They have specific initiatives to improve the shading of old people's homes, so that inside the building, the old people don't get too hot and others vulnerable to heat stress. So they would, I mean, in Southern Europe, it's not unusual to have shutters and to have blinds to prevent sun coming in through big glass windows in the summer. But in Ireland and in the UK, it's quite rare to have those things. But some cities in the Northern Europe have begun to do that kind of thing to reduce heat stress levels. And also not just in old people's homes, but also in kindergartens, in nurseries, because of course very young people are vulnerable to this kind of thing as well. So we looked at kind of those specific measures, whether they were included in the plans. Obviously, there may be other things that these cities are doing that were not included in the strategy documents that they published, but these were what we were able to find as being some examples. What we didn't really find was whether those people themselves were consulted about what might be a good idea, whether it was a good idea to include this kind of shading, for example, in the kindergarten review, or what else could have been done to improve the situation.
Thanks a lot, Peter. Thank you. And we see some questions in the chat coming up now. More questions about the social aspect of climate adaptation, which is perfect because this is the moment to invite you to the eMag that we will have in the month of May, which is going to be quite exactly on the questions of social justice in European adaptation policies. But not to forget that next month we have one on habitat, on sustainable habitat in Africa. And you have the links on the screen. And over to Estelle.
Thank you so much, Tania. Oui, comme Tania a dit, nous aurons, voici nos 2 prochains rendez-vous.
As Tania said, this is going to be our next event on April 25th on sustainable habitat. We will talk about our roadmap from Yaoundé 6 months before the Urban Global Summit in Cairo and before the EU election on May 30th. We will have another eMag talking about social justice and the social aspects, which are still not very clear in the adaptation policy. So please scan the QR codes and you'll find the links in the chat box as well to register for these 2 eMags. And please do contact us if you have any questions, but we need to end this eMag today. Do not hesitate to come back to us, to get in touch with us if you have additional questions. You find our email address here on the screen. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to our interpreter, to our speakers, to our participants for joining us today. And we hope we can be again together in our next eMag. Thank you all. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Stay in touch.